And any of you that are social workers, just know you are the best thing next to Score candy bars. That's my favorite. But social workers are the best people in the world. And so I'm a social worker by training. I'm a social worker for life. However, my HIV experience took me around the globe. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mozambique at the onset of PEPFAR. And after I finished PEPFAR, I ended up staying in Africa. As Jim said, I plan to make you guys laugh. So I went to one of my white friends and I was like, why are all the white people still in Africa? And she was like, because we don't pay taxes. And I was like, girl, stop playing. She was like, no, for real. And I was like, really? I want one of those jobs. And basically what she was saying is that if you work for an international nonprofit based in the United States of America, you do not pay federal or state taxes if you work overseas. I said, ching. That's my one of my pathways to reparations, not being able to pay taxes. So I stayed and lived in Mozambique and traveled and worked in Zimbabwe and South Africa and other places. And then decided to get married and have a baby there, and then relocated back to the States to take care of my dad in Chicago until he passed away. That led me to Los Angeles to work at UCLA at the Center for at the Care Center. I stayed there for about 3 years before I got recruited into pharma. I will tell you now, full disclosure, I'm on my lunch break. And so this time is mine. So, right, Jim? I'm on my lunch break and this time is mine. So that being said, I'm not representing anyone or anyone else's interest except for mine and yours during this time. And so all of that led me, when I was at UCLA, I really became interested in clinical research. I was hired because of an NIH funded grant. This grant, if I'm not mistaken, probably has been funded and refunded many, many times because there's always this query around, how do we get more people of African descent in the United States, African Americans, Latinx folks, gender nonconforming trans folks, same gender loving men, specifically Black and Latinx men in trials. And although I think it's a relevant question to ask, oftentimes I think what is missing is that we are not hard to find. Danielle Campbell says this all the time. It's not that we're hard to find, but it may be that the tools and the process that a particular group is utilizing is not as effective. And I say that within the context of this conversation for a couple of reasons. Number one, what I have found is that when an African-American person, Black person is asked to be in a trial, they are engaged, all of their questions are asked and answered. There's a lot of patience and temperament. There's an opportunity to build trust. There are all of these nuance to relationship building that are intact. Then is when I believe that we can shift the needle to Black folks being in clinical trials. And I've seen it just with myself. So because I respect the science deeply, I will not talk about the protocol of the Moderna trial that I'm in. I will not talk about anything that will potentially impact the data when it is finally released to the public. And when I am no longer in the trial, because I'm currently still in the trial. I will remain in the trial for 2 years. And so just a little background, immediately after, the world shifted, I and myself, Jim, and a few others ended up founding the Global COVID Advisory Board. And when we were all coming together, what was apparent to me and others that for those of us that work in HIV, this virus, this, SARS-CoV-2, it was our time. It was our time to translate and discuss viruses at a level that we have the entire world's attention. It was our time to discuss some of the similarities between COVID and HIV, specifically the impact on individuals, families, communities, stigma. And y'all know stigma is real right now. Like if someone starts coughing right now, usually the next thing that follows is, I don't have COVID. Even though no one probably even asked that or assumed that, it's like, I don't have COVID, right? Or if you say, yeah, I'm dating, or I want to go out to this club, and then people are looking at you like, oh my God, are you a super spreader? Like, what's going on? Are you not being considerate of everyone else, right? So some of the stigma and some of the shaming that comes with being human. I feel that in HIV, we do that the best. We do that the best. We know how to listen to people. We know how to affirm individuals. We know how to pull people together. So when COVID came, I was like, yes, bet. I want to be a part of any and everything that's happening. The first opportunity that I had was, I believe it was like the global campaign, and someone can put in the chat if you remember. It was the global campaign to get, to garner interest in those who may want to join a clinical trial. So they were looking, I believe, for 1 million people. And you could go on a website and sign up, and then they would potentially contact you. Well, that didn't happen because I'm pretty sure that website was managed by volunteers. And all of us know if you're a volunteer, once you set something up, that's it. And so I wanted to continue to be persistent and explore what clinical trials were going to happen in New Orleans. At the time, that a lot of clinical trials for COVID were in, preclinical phase 1 and phase 2. What people may not know is that New Orleans suffered a huge devastation within its cultural community. So if you know, New Orleans is really driven by its culture, right? It's driven by its culture, it's driven by all of the things that people come to New Orleans for. They come for Mardi Gras, they come for Southern decadence, they come for essence, they come for all of these opportunities for people just to love on each other. And so at the beginning of COVID, Zulu, which is the largest men's social club for African-American men, were deeply impacted by COVID. They had approximately 22 to 23 members to die. And this was when we were all trying to figure it out. So from the end of February, which was Mardi Gras, up until we knew, right, March 13th, when the world just pressed pause. And then leading into us really starting to understand COVID, they lost so many people. So it was a huge blow to the community, a huge blow to the culture, but more importantly, a huge blow to many, many families. They lost either their breadwinner, they lost their brothers and husbands and fathers and cousins and sons. And the impact to this day is still felt. It's felt very deeply. Many of you all know we did not have Mardi Gras this year. We have a Black mayor, Mayor LaToya Cantrell, and she's one of 6 Black mayors of major cities in the United States. And she said, absolutely not. And the primary reason was, number one, New Orleans, we make everything off of tourism. That is our number one source of income. And Black folks and Latin folks are the ones working everything for Mardi Gras. So she said, some people have seen the memes and stuff. I'm not on social media, but TD said no. TD said, no, we are not doing this, not this year. And so that being said, when for me, when it was time to join, I thought about a lot of people. I thought about, those early trials, even the Moderna trial and other trials were not inclusive of people living with HIV. I thought about those individuals when I decided to join. I thought about my daughter, who at the time was 12. And although Moderna and Pfizer currently have adolescent trials going for 12 to 16-year-olds, I still thought about her, right? I wanted her to see that, that trusting the science is something that is definitely possible if you want to, right? If you make a decision. What's interesting is that when I took Inyasha to her pediatrician, and I called the pediatrician before. Her pediatrician is a white woman. She's so dope, though. We followed her all over the city. So whenever she leaves, we leave. And I said, Dr. Douglas, I want to talk to Inyasha about joining the Pfizer trial. And she was like, okay. It's like, I just want you to do like the science literacy and explain vaccines to her and blah, 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 because she trusts you and, all this stuff. So we're sitting in the room and I said, oh, Inyasha, no, Dr. Douglas says, hey, Inyasha, your mom says you might, we want to talk to you about the Pfizer trial. She's like, I'm not joining the trial. And so Dr. Douglas was like, well, what happened? She was like, I'm not doing that. I'll wait. And I was like, okay. So totally needed to shut up the conversation about her joining the trial. So then I also thought about, at the time that my interest of the trial was growing, when we moved here from California, my mom had died 6 months prior. And so the HIV community had really enveloped and loved on me during that process. And so when we moved to New Orleans, we ended up meeting this wonderful New Orleanian woman. And I have to say her name, Miss Arlene. Miss Arlene was our neighbor. She adopted us like family. Inyasha's grandparents, were pretty much deceased except for one in Zimbabwe. And Miss Arlene became her stand-in grandmother. And she did everything with her. So in the South, Grandparents' Day is a big deal, a really big deal. Like no school, you do festivities, it's really cool. And so Miss Arlene will go to those events with her. And then Miss Arlene just disclosed to us about 2 years ago that she was suffering with lupus, had been diagnosed with lupus for about 21 years at the time. And during COVID, I literally watched her transition. It was not my intention, of course, nor need to want to have that experience with her. However, it gave me such pride and such joy to make homemade soup for her, to love on her, to just support her, and also to stand in for her in this trial because she was on chemotherapy prior to dying. She did not leave her house at all except to go to chemo. And everything that she did, she had to do within her home. So I wanted to join for those reasons. And so why Moderna? For me, I chose the Moderna trial because that is what was available here in New Orleans. That was accessible to me. I did not hear any advertisements on the radio for it. I did not frequent places where they had pamphlets and other types of marketing material for it. It was purely my choice, my decision. I knew that I was very familiar with Tuskegee and what happened during Tuskegee. I was very familiar with medical mistrust. I was explaining to Jim that, and some people on this call don't know, that January 2020, I survived 4 strokes. And you may hear me slow down sometimes because of that. I try to be very intentional with my words. I had no pre-existing conditions. I didn't meet any markers in terms of someone to have a stroke. I didn't have high cholesterol, didn't have high blood pressure, but I had stress, and that led to a blood clot that had traveled to the right side of my brain. And as a result, that's how I wasn't able to get oxygen to my brain. And so I started off 2020 at Emory Hospital. I had gone to Atlanta to a yoga retreat. So I was namasteing into 2020. And then my body said, guess what? I'm gonna put some paralysis in this right quick. And it's been a really, really interesting road. So when it was time for me to consider joining, I became a part of the population of and so I had a lot to consider. As you all can see. When I decided to join, I remember after 2 months after signing up, because the demand was really high for the trial, right? And especially in New Orleans. Now, the demand from whom? Not quite sure. However, in New Orleans, the demand was high. So when the study coordinator contacted me and we did the phone interview, the inclusion and exclusion criteria over the phone, she did ask about my pre-existing conditions. And for Moderna, that was one of the qualifications, that you needed to be stable with your pre-existing conditions. And so I was on medication. I went from taking 0 pills to, at that time, I think I was taking probably about 12 pills a day to get to get everything stable. So I joined the trial, and I remember going to the clinical trial site, and they had, because of COVID, they had bags, and these bags had like a pen, it had your informed consent in the bag. It was like 23 pages long, and it had like knickknacks and different things to kind of promote the study. And so, I sat in the lobby, I read in detail the informed consent. I really wanted to know, what was this mechanism of action? And of course, I'm saying and processing mentally a lot of terminology that I was familiar with, right? But I wasn't alone in that waiting room. There were a lot of people that particular day, all spaced out, of course, going in for their first visit. So going to the first visit, and my, I guess she was like the study nurse, study phlebotomist. Yeah, she was like the study nurse, study phlebotomist. And she, so during the intake, it was a 3-hour intake, I kept hearing this noise. So any of you who have any traumatic brain injuries or anything, we're very sensitive to sound. And so I was like, what is that noise? And so she had her Bluetooth like speaker thing in her ear. And I was like, okay, that's different. And so we're going through the process. And I said, well, can we talk a little bit about the trial? And she was like, oh, did you get the informed consent? I was like, yes, ma'am, I did. She was like, oh, okay, it's all there. Oh, okay. Well, what if I have some questions? And so she immediately called the PI of the study, who went by his first name. And, he was able to answer the questions that I had pertaining to the study. But I just found it interesting that, they had this Black woman as the person to get you all settled and I think they took about 9 tubes of blood from me, and because they were looking for autoimmune diseases to make sure that, I didn't have anything. And however, she was not able to answer some of the finer details of the study. That withstanding, what I appreciated most is that she was able to defer to the PI. And so not a co-PI, she was able to defer to the PI to come in and say, hey, this lady has some questions. Would you mind sitting with her and having a conversation? And he did that. Another aspect of the Moderna trial in my city, because I believe that in every city is probably different because it's led by different CRSs or clinical research sites. And in my city in New Orleans, the PI gave you his cell phone number. And so like he and I were texting yesterday because when Moderna was approved, they opened up the opportunity to all trial participants to find out if you were a part of the placebo if you receive the actual vaccine. So basically it's a process called being unblinded. And so I chose to be unblinded. And what I will share is that I received the placebo, and then I was able to receive the vaccine. So this week I needed to text Dr. Mike. It's okay, you can know his name, Dr. Mike, and say, hey, Dr. Mike, I need to come in for my second vaccine. Can I come in on this day? And he was able to make that happen. Overall, my experience has been really interesting. It's been different in terms of the research sites. Aside from that nurse and the people that work in the lab, I didn't see anyone that looked like me. For those of you that are researchers or research advocates or translational scientists, you know that being able to see yourself in every aspect of the research is an imperative. So when we start, really thinking about what Danielle Campbell talks about, it's not that we're hard to find, maybe your strategy needs to change. That may be a potential strategy shift that we consider. Secondly, in terms of the community response to me being in a trial, I would say it's mixed. So I get a lot of, oh, good for you, good for you. I get a lot of, thank you for doing that. I get a lot of, you got your fingers and your toes still? Mm-hmm. I get a lot of, so what actually did they do? And the irony and the beautiful part for me, no one asked, what was your compensation? No one has asked that. Now, my running joke, because they load your money on a little card. So usually I get my coffee from McDonald's. So when I go to McDonald's, they're looking for a chip and I give them my card. I was like, that's my food stamp card. And they're looking like, really? I was like, girl, EBT. And, we just let that slide. But that's the only thing I'm able to buy with it is some McDonald's coffee. So I'm not buying sofas. I'm not going to the Seychelles. I'm not doing any of that. I'm buying some coffee at McDonald's.
Hey, Kieta?
Yeah.
I want to just jump in because you're talking about compensation. And, we just had a training for our case managers here in the city and county. And it came up that there's some skepticism when people are paid to be in clinical research. It feels like people are being induced or being kind of led in by money and then are mistreated. So can you just talk a little bit about how compensation works in clinical trials, in yours or the ones you're aware of, and why compensation happens at all, and how we try to have equipoise around inducements. We don't want to induce people, but we want to provide enough to reflect the time that they give, those sorts of tensions.
Jen, that's a really good question, because I think the compensation question has come up within industry, outside of industry, as well as these clinical research sites. So many sites will have a standard compensation for all their trials, unless the trial sponsor enables the site to compensate the person more or differently. For example, there have been some studies that have enabled childcare to be a part of their quote unquote compensation, right? How they deliver the particular research. I will tell you that, and I've been a part of these conversations, a research participant is someone who is literally donating their body to science. The late Timothy Ray Brown, I personally believe he should have been a millionaire. He literally donated his body to science. I don't think that there's any compensation that could really give people what they deserve for donating their body to science.
And right, it's you're donating your body and you're giving samples of your blood and tissues and all of that. but it's also like a lot of time. Like
It's a
you
lot of
spend a
time. Yeah.
lot of your time, and there's transportation needs to and from. So compensation
Also,
covers those sorts of things.
exactly. And it covers it, but not in full, right?
Right.
So if you live in Los Angeles, if you live in South Central Los Angeles and your research site is in Santa Monica at UCLA, your lift is not going to, that $25 that you may get for being in that study is not going to cover your lift. More importantly, it's not going to cover the time that you may have to spend. So I personally believe that compensation needs to be more. I think it should be relative to the city in which the person is living. And I do believe that a community advisory board of individuals that are looking at pay equity, living wage and quality of life wage equity should be a part of those conversations, that it should no longer exist in a tunnel.
Yeah. And Kieta, can you go, you mentioned the informed consent, but it also came up in our training, this idea that, people would be recruited into a study and have sort of no idea what's happening to them or what the study is about. And I don't disagree that these things have happened in the past, but informed consent is one of the tools that we have to ensure a variety of things happen, that you're educated about the study, that you have a chance to ask questions. So, can you talk a little bit more about the informed consent process? And I just want to weave in a question that came up in the chat.
Excellent.
And of course, people want you to eventually talk about any side effects you've had from the vaccine. You've been vaccinated, had at least one dose. But why would there be a study nurse or a study employee who is really unable to answer questions? So, Sanford asked this question. It seems as though they should have been at least able to attempt to answer the questions. And was she a token to make others comfy, in your opinion? So talk about keeping it real, Sanford. Thank you. So that's a real question. So I'd like you to answer that, and then talk a little bit about the informed consent and how that is a protection for people who are engaging in as a participant.
Absolutely. Now, to all of my folks out there who, speak and advocate for people who may not know as much as Kieta or may not know as much as Sanford, right? Or Jim. Let's be clear. The consent can be complicated, right? There's a lot of scientific and medical terminology, as well as disclosures that if you don't have someone who's patient and attentive and willing to explain everything to you verbatim, the way that I was asking, then it can become very overwhelming, right? So that it appears as if it's a process that's rushed through. To answer Sanford's question, I don't know. Sanford. I don't know. Maybe she is the only phlebotomist or study nurse that is African-American at that site, possibly. There was no one like at check-in that looked like me, or with a hue that was darker during any other process except for in the laboratory.
So can I ask a question?
Yes,
I'm wondering whether or not there are protocols in place that restricted her from answering certain kinds of questions. You see that especially if the question is one that needs to be interpreted. And so if she does, it would seem that she would indicate to the party that she is unable to answer the question, and or she can identify someone that can answer the question for her. But if she's restricted, the question is she being transparent about that? Versus when I look at Sanford's questions, it's like I wondered whether the question was based in the fact that she didn't know the answers versus she knew the answers but had some other protocol or restrictions that had prevented her from getting into things that could go left.
I agree with you, Dr. Bambi. That is likely the position that she may have been in, or also what Sanford pointed out, right? I will say, and I shared this with Jim, that her initial response to me prior to calling in the PI was, "Did you read it? You didn't read it? You didn't read the informed consent?
And that's why I asked the question in the chat, because we're talking about Henrietta Lacks, medical mistrust. I won't name the places, but I've worked on a vaccine trial, HIV vaccine trial, behavioral studies. And to your point, it makes one hell of a difference to see someone that looks like you other than the person that's doing outreach. And to me, she should have been able to answer some questions. If it got really technical on hemoglobins, blah, 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 give me a moment. I'll be right back. Because of your knowledge, you continued. But if we're talking about this webinar, someone that does not have a bit of our knowledge would go back and say, child. That's going to hit the community faster than $1 million ad campaign.
So let me ask the question then again. So what is our obligation if in fact we're talking about engaging in clinical trials and I've been recently participating as a faith ambassador with the co-VPN network. And we've been hosting a series of public conversations, educating folks, as you probably know, about the vaccines, about the trials, etc. We have not gotten into, we describe what the trials are. We describe the phases. We educate the participants about what they could expect. But when you look at the map of where these trials are being held, most of them are majority organizations. They're majority universities. They're not at Meharry. They're not at Morehouse. They're not at historically Black colleges. They are with the medical school. They're at historical majority institutions. And so I guess, where is the feedback? So, I mean, if you, as a highly skilled and educated participant, and to Sanford's point, if you go in, where's the space on your departure, or where's the space in the process where you say, I have issues with how I was addressed. I have issues with the fact that you don't have anybody that looks like me, engaging me, but yet your percentage on Moderna and Pfizer is only 10% Black participation. So you can't have both. You can't have our participation while simultaneously not hiring people that look like us.
Now, Dr. Bambi, so my particular site was not a university site. It was a community site that is just a CRS, so clinical research site, that does clinical research in a lot of other trials, shingles, pneumonia, other types of things. So because this was a community, what they consider a community access point, it seems like their approach was a little bit different in the fact that they had that one individual, right? And then they had the people in the lab, and those are probably individuals that are always there. They were not recruited exclusively or specifically for the Moderna trials.
So my question is, where in the process?
I'm about to answer that.
Okay.
I'm about to answer that. And so I think that some of the ways in which that can occur is, one, having the fact that I have that direct access, and I have that direct access to my study coordinator, which goes by first name basis, text basis, and also the PI for that study, being able to say to both of them, because the PI, right, the principal investigator, sets the tone for any study, whether it's university or community. It's their name and their reputation on the line, and they can determine how their budget is disseminated to see who they're going to hire. The PI does that, not the companies. The companies have no jurisdiction to dictate to a site what to do in terms of their recruitment or who they hire and things like that. They can make financial allowances for them to hire. However, they cannot tell them, you must hire this person, you must hire that person. And I'm sure Sanford knows that from his experiences as well. Also having the opportunity during the trial engagement, because for Moderna, they contact you a lot. There's a lot of follow-up. So there's a lot of opportunity for you to give feedback. And some of the questions that are posed are general, right? Some of the questions are, how has your experience been? So in terms of where creating space, one, I think it would be communicating directly to the research site about what's going on, right? And sometimes, let's be honest, when you're in the midst of heavily recruiting for a trial, you may or may not be open to feedback at that time.
That's not your problem.
Oh no, I know it's not my problem. I know it's not my problem, but at the same time, I also am very cautious of just the relationship that needs to be developed so that when I do give my feedback, that they actually hear me and that they don't see my feedback as an aversion to the trial, but something that will potentially complement them expanding their recruitment, expanding how they outreach to communities. And that, that's just my opinion.
I just want to just mention a little bit more about the consent process, and then I think just more about how it is being in this study, and I know people want to hear about your first dose because you were dosed with placebos during the first part of the study. You've just gotten the actual vaccine recently. But it's concerning to me that an informed consent wouldn't have, so it is technical and a lot of science, and can be mind numbing. But any informed consent, that would be passed muster through an institutional review board would have it broken down in language that's understandable, right? 7th or 8th grade language, and be able to talk through difficult and confusing concepts like mRNA. Like if you don't know about mRNA, that's confusing. And so we talk a lot in the HIV space about creating, tools to help walk through these things, videos, show and tell, all kinds of things that kind of help people understand. Was any of that, when you had questions for the PI, and I know you're already coming in there very educated, but was there an attempt to sort of talk this in language that's not crazy, in language that's not scientific, in ways that are understandable and approachable for your average person who's not thinking about science every day?
Yeah. So to answer your question succinctly, yes. The PI did explain any questions that I had. That I think often occurs with informed consent and how the consent is developed is, for example, if the benchmark is 8th grade, there's an assumption that people have acquired the skills needed to get to the 8th grade. I can just speak as a parent, and I always tell people I'm a taxpayer in Louisiana, so that enables me to, really understand a lot of stuff that happens in this part of the Deep South. About 4 weeks ago, a report came out that students in schools in Louisiana from kindergarten to 3rd grade were unable to read. And the report was so devastating that it got federal attention. So essentially, basically what that means is that, potentially federal dollars will come to offer some assistance. We have to remember that this system, or this poor education system, did not just happen. People have been struggling with that for a while. So if you are a clinical trial participant and you didn't go to Xavier or Dillard or Tulane, and you're here and you're asking questions and you're curious, an 8th grade level still may not be what's good for you. A 6th grade level still may not be what's good for you. You really need, what you just said, Jim, someone to talk you through those terminologies, what is involved in the process. And I'll give an example. Because of COVID, the consult rooms had to be open. And Sanford and other people know when you are in a clinical trial, usually it's closed, but because of COVID, it had to be open. So I'm in the trial room, I'm in the consult room, getting a blood draw. And then I happen to overhear an elderly woman next door. And the reason why I presume she was elderly was because there was, and I don't mean to be an ageist, but there was a conversation about the type of app that she needed that the trial required. And so the conversation was, do you have internet? No. Do you have any internet in your area? No. Do you have someone we can call that might know where internet is located? Yes. And so then the process became, her trying to access a family member to help her understand, this is how you participate in the trial. This is what, after we give you your first injection, this is what we need to know within 7 days, and blah, 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 blah. That for me was an indication that, one, not everyone joining the trial knows all aspects of fully of what they're doing. But then it also was affirming to me that they did not discard this woman, right? Whoever she was, from joining the trial. They said, you know what? You walked through the door. And I remember seeing her when we were in the waiting room, but you walked through the door. And walking through the door here was enough for us to bring the PI in, bring someone else in, talk to you about free internet. Like, I heard the conversation. It was, is there a Starbucks or a library or somewhere near you where you can go and have internet access so you can use this app? So for me, I saw that there was a little progress, not to mention that we still have a long way to go. Jim, to answer your question in terms of like how I felt after, I felt exactly what the FDA indication said for Moderna. I felt some arm soreness. I did not take any Tylenol prior to. I applied a warm water bottle to it afterwards, and made sure that I continued to exercise it as much as I can. And we'll see what happens after the second dose, which will happen this Thursday.
And we're coming up on the hour. We'll probably go a few minutes after, but not too far. So I want to make sure if people have questions now, feel free to type them in or open up your mic and ask them. But I want to go back to something and kind of, I think this is a very interesting issue. It's gotten a lot of discussion, obviously, today. But going back to the Black woman who you encountered as the study nurse / phlebotomist, and someone's comment, Ryan's comment is, it's possible, but isn't assuming that she got there just because of her race problematic? That could just not be her job. Maybe she could have answered questions, but it wasn't the one she was asked. So I think just, I think importantly saying, some of us may be making assumptions about it, but I guess at the end of the day, the fact is you didn't see a whole lot of Black people working on this study. And we know that best practices for engaging communities of color in studies is to have people who represent those communities working at every level, not just the outreach, but nurse, doctor, PI, support staff, the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree with Ryan. And I think I'll just reiterate my previous statement that this was a CRS, a clinical research site, that was not a COVID site. They were not exclusively COVID. She probably knew very well the shingles informed consent, because that's one of their trials. She could have well known the pneumococcal pneumonia informed consent. That was one of her trials. COVID had hit and everyone was in reaction mode. What can we do? How can we do it as soon as we can do it? So I don't fault her. Every time I get a chance to see her and say hi, or get a blood draw, we have a little laugh and opportunity to chat. But it more than likely was not her full-time gig.
So thank you for saying that. And I think in our final minutes, just what are some of the lessons you've learned from engaging in this clinical trial that you could pass on to other people who may be interested but may be a little hesitant because they're afraid of being mistreated or being railroaded in some way, being disrespected, and stemming from very, very logical and reasonable skepticism and mistrust and hesitancy.
So I know the last part of my, like when we titled the talk, shifting the narrative. And I believe that the narrative shift, as much as I want it to be a collective, systemic, overall U-Haul and just ban the system, it ain't gonna happen like that. So for me, my motto has been during this COVID era is to, one, keep my faith. My faith is very important to me. And I'm choosing faith over fear. And that's for me. And I think all of us have to make individual decisions. I don't speak for anybody, not even my own child. I don't even speak for her because she has a big old mouth. But keeping my faith, trusting the science. And when I say trusting the science, I have to remind myself, I have been getting immunized since I came into this world. And especially as a mother, I remember, and those of you that are mothers, when it was time to leave the hospital, they said she needed an MMR and a Hep B and a polio shot. And I was like, okay. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't ask, is it gonna hurt her? I didn't ask anything. Do I feel any kind of tinge of regret for that? Hindsight, yeah. I wish I would have knew a little bit more, right? So for those that who may be delayed vaxxers or anti-vaxxers, I get it, right? You ask enough questions, you might make a different decision. But my husband and I at the time, we made the decision, let's get her vaccinated so we can go. So when I look at my immunization card, typhoid, all this stuff that I have to be immunized for, especially as a global traveler, I got it without asking questions. Kieta, are you saying not to ask questions about COVID? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
No,
Definitely ask questions. But I think in asking the question, being willing to inform, to be informed, and also to inform others. And then the last thing for me during COVID is doing my part. I've said that I keep my faith, I trust the science, and I do my part. And my part for me was to engage in a COVID clinical trial. I get people being hesitant, but I also understand the power of having a conversation. And really quick, I went to buy a sofa recently. And when I walked into the sofa store, you have all the attendees kind of standing there like, oh, it's fresh meat. And so when I walked in, I looked around and there was one Black woman in the crowd, and I pointed at her, I said, come here. And she looked around like, who are you talking about? She was like, yeah. And I was like, well, come on, let's talk. And so she got me my sofa. I had to come back to the store. And we started talking about COVID. I think she was asking a question about not being able to travel. And I said, it's a virus. It's going to be around for a while. She was like, do you really think so? And I was like, yeah, I'm in a trial. She was like, really? Now, mind you, we're walking to the cash register. She stops and sits down on one of the sofas in the store. And we sit and have a conversation for 30 minutes about the trial. When we finished talking about just what is a virus, what is a vaccine, how it works, at the end of that, she said, you know what, I'm going to really consider getting the vaccine when my number comes up, when it's time for me to do it. And I said, do it for you, right? Because I don't know if I need to be revaccinated. We don't know if it will last 6 months or a year. We don't know when variants come, what will happen. I don't know anything. But what I do know is that my part was to engage and take the vaccine and to be a part of that, and also to be a conduit, right? For me, when I think of medical mistrust and all of the damage that has come, a central theme to all of that, for me, was not humanizing the individuals that came through the door. So Henrietta Lacks was not humanized. All of those men for all of those decades in Alabama were not humanized. In Dr. Washington's book, Medical Mistrust, many examples of how people are not humanized. And Sanford talked about it earlier as well, just his own experiences. We know, me, Jim, Sanford, and others, we know what happens at these clinical research sites, my God. And I think that in order for things to really, really, really change, more of us have to start to get involved in a way that is comfortable to us, right? So Dr. Bambi talked about serving with Stefan and Michelle and the work that they're doing with the COVID PN. Absolutely amazing. That's her part, right? And her part is to ensure that other faith folks, especially in the Deep South, are doing right by educating people around COVID, right? Around what is a virus, around what is a vaccine. That's her part. What's really important for me is that Black people understand that we have a part. You have a responsibility to yourself, and more importantly, we have a responsibility to the wider community.
So I have a quick last question. As the spokesperson for COVID Prevention Trial Network, do they ask you to report back your experiences in the process to any of their advisory groups or whatever?
COVID or
I'm
research.
looking at on the disclaimer where Jim said you're speaking as courtesy of an arrangement through the COVID Prevention Trial Network. And so my question is related to that. So your experiences that you've shared today, is there an avenue that they've created for you to translate this back to that network?
Oh, I just text Stefan or Michelle. And I'm also on, the NIH has funded certain community engagement sites. So they have the Louisiana SEAL project. And then SEAL, that funding is a spinoff of COVID PN. So I'm involved on the community advisory board for SEAL. And also however, I have communication, I feed it back to those individuals all the time. And because of Stefan, that's how I end up here today, because he recommended me to speak about this topic. But no, I'm a teller. I'm snitching.
Before we close out, not everyone's going to know who Dr. Stefan Wallace is. So can you give a 10-second bio about Stefan?
Yeah, so Dr. Stefan Wallace in Stanford has been working in vaccines forever. And our amazing, one of his mentors, Stefan and Dr. Michelle Andrasic, worked together to develop a global community engagement plan and organization that is known now as the COVID PN. So Dr. Stefan Wallace is probably one of the most accessible, brilliant, kind scientists, Black scientists that I have ever met. And he's located in DC at Fred Hutchinson.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Washington.
Seattle.
Seattle,
State.
right?
Yeah.
He's the director of external relations. The other thing that's really interesting about Dr. Stefan, and then we're going to have to probably close out, but what I love about his story, not only is he brilliant and have many letters after his name and doctorates and masters, he is rooted in and connected to the house and ball scene. So he has a perspective on community that is so organic and so deeply embedded. And he brings that connection, that community connection, and his roots to what he does today, leading global engagement of communities. This is a global gig, right? COVID is everywhere. And so I just wanted to make sure people understood just how fabulous he was. And of course, he reached out to you to do this talk. So we know he's got good taste.
And I would like to say too, to all of you that, one thing that I did like at the beginning of COVID is reach out to people who we know do this work all the time, the Greg Millett's and the Russell Brewers and Keith Greens and other folks that you're like, I know you're fighting for the community, the Stefans and the Michelles. And for a lot of us, we have, this advantage and opportunity to not think about anything else right now during COVID, right? But just focus on ourselves. We get to work from home or at home. We get to Zoom or not Zoom. We get to on camera or off camera. We don't have to be in rooms and spaces where the humanity of Black and brown folks is often not at the table. So I commend them for everything that they have done. they are doing and that they will do. And also, I'm very thankful for all of you for being here today.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and just how individual and how personal it really is to think about a study, to be in a study. I think you really captured that beautifully and brought up some really important issues around mistrust and how studies work. And so I think this time has been really invaluable. I really thank you for spending it with us, your lunch hour. So I'm gonna take this moment to say thanks everyone else for hanging out with us. Thanks for hanging out longer than we had planned. But I love that there's still over 30 people here. But we do know it's time to go. So thanks all for your time and take good care.
Ciao. Thank y'all. Hugs.